I would try to suggest some actual questions.
Good afternoon, or evening actually now, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico. Starting oil painting as of yet untitled. I've got some very liquid yellow ochre and cadmium yellow mixed in, cadmium yellow light, mixed in together to make a very loose wash, and then a brilliant red to display with some line work. So we'll see where this goes.
In the species mind. And two is a question about the relationship between this bifurcation and other bifurcations. And then three is a theory which would not be taken too seriously as a particular relationship between this bifurcation and some other one I propose for the sake of discussion. Well, all of this is very hypothetical. So, one, the unconscious. Well, I did a talk recently in the history of consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. That's the most successful program at UCS, the internationally known graduate program. Thousands of applicants every year for few places. So to begin with, I challenged them to change the name from the history of consciousness to the history of unconsciousness. So, as long as we restrict attention to the historical period, then there's not much to say. But all the interesting events I want to point out are prehistoric, so therefore we have to speculate. Among the possibilities are that the conscious mind developed from the unconscious mind. Another one is that the unconscious mind developed from the conscious mind. And another one is that consciousness existed always, and that there was never any division. All these possibilities. So for the sake of discussion, I'll choose one, my favorite one, but only for today. And that is the consciousness is always, and the unconscious is recently created. So that we can do it like this, where we have consciousness going on, and then the unconscious begins one day, created by an accident in a historical accident or a natural law of evolution. This fantasy, however, because of peculiarities in conscious, in the evolution of conscious mind and culture and civilization and so on, more and more things were regarded as illegal in the current world view, and by the paradigm rejected from above the curtain below, so that as we go along, unconscious begins growing from modest origins. Well, the conscious mind correspondingly shrinks. So eventually, it was more like this, where you have conscious, unconscious, because this is growing. And in its growing, evolution, further bifurcations, morphogenesis, and emergence of form in the unconscious, so all what we identify today as fundamental deck furniture of the unconscious, the dreams, the archetypal symbols, and so on. All of that is evolved and has evolved from simpler origins and so on. And this history of the unconscious we seek to discuss. So I'll call that the bifurcation theory of the unconscious. Now, one virtue of this theory before going on to number two is that allows us to see our conscious mind in evolution from the universal conscious mind. The Gaian mind is then regarded as conscious. The animal mind is conscious. The mind of plants, all of this, we can speak of the consciousness of animals, the consciousness of plants, the consciousness of Mother Earth, the consciousness of Father Sky, the consciousness of their partnership in the nuclear family of love and everything. And this is valuable if we could promote this somehow in terms of our future in relating with respect to the mind of all the other entities. Now, number two, this question is about the relationship of this bifurcation in the history of consciousness and other bifurcations in the history of ideas, such as the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, the fall of Archangel, Lucifer, other angels, and so on, the creation of the devil, the growth, the emergence, and importance of evil, the empowerment of the negative, Brahman, and so on. There are a lot of other dichotomies which might have emerged from the unity by a process of mitosis, as it were, in the world of ideas. And we can try to relate these bifurcation events to each other in time, or in space, or as waves, or causal relationships, or whatever, your favorite one. But third, for example, I'm going to recommend an example which, for me, was the source of my thinking about the history of unconsciousness in this way. So this is a specific hypothesis on the creation of the unconscious by the rejection of something according to dogmatic paradigm. And this has to do with Marduk and Tiamat, the first creation myth that I know about that has the subjugation of chaos by law and order executive, a cosmic god, the war between chaos and cosmos, won by cosmos, the king of law and order. The first one I know about is Marduk and Tiamat, and this is historical, and it's written on tablets. It's part of the Akiki festival that I always talk about. It was celebrated for 2,000 years in a row throughout Babylonia by the Akkadians, the Semitic successors to the Sumerian civilization. And in this horror story, repeated every year and actually acted out by the king playing the role of Marduk, Tiamat, a dragon, goddess of chaos, is actually divided in two, murdered with a sword, stretched. The two halves opened like an oyster shell, forming the sky and the earth at the beginning of the Babylonian creation myth. At this time, this ritual, so in the time when rituals were performed well and successfully in stabilizing the evolution of culture, chaos, which is essential to life and happiness, was subjugated. But we experience it all the time, but that was not allowed by the paradigm. And in this myth, what created, I claim, the unconscious, the negative charge on the serpent image, the snake, the innocent, the essential symbol of Mother Earth itself, the consciousness of Gaia, that this symbol came to be associated with Hades, with evil, with terrorism, with Pluto, with the torture of Ereshkigal and submitted the torture of Inanna by Ereshkigal and so on in the underworld. Somehow is associated. Chaos goes to the basement, and with this gesture created a bifurcation of consciousness, giving us the unconscious, which appears to be gaining ever since. And in this gain, also, our life, our history of the human species, going and more into the evil, the demonic, the evolutionarily unsuccessful forms of society. That's the 1, 2, 3 of it.
I see. So you're in favor of a kind of fold theory of the unconscious?
Yes. One from which, if we adopted, we could seek also to escape. And we would have a mechanism to escape because we have a historical map, as it were, of the creation itself.
How would escape happen?
We would bring unconsciousness back into consciousness. We would take the deck furniture from the lower floors of the boat back up to the deck where it belongs. We would take back what's happening if, this is just an example of the chaos theory of bifurcation or creation of the unconscious. In this case, we see that science, which is the main temple of law and order, is now having to eat humble pie and to accept chaos again. That's a good thing, I think, for our future. And this good thing is apparently happening more or less accidentally. But suppose that we had this talk in 1960, and we decided that we would try to do something intentional to restore Tiamat to her throne, to bring up chaos from the unconscious and make it okay. Then we hunt around, so these computer people, we locate Ed Lorenz, we popularize his model, and we revolutionize the sciences on purpose in 1963, instead of waiting for it to happen spontaneously in 1973. And if we'd done that, we'd never know. But that it would never have happened without our intentional intervention. So I'm not recommending an intentional intervention. I'm just saying that if some of these things are brought into consciousness, that the little that we do in our lives for the future generations, it consists of this discussion alone, maybe all it takes is we can bring something back from the basement, to put it in consciousness, starting a new upward spiral somewhere in the evolution of the spirit.
That's kind of
Well,
fun.
could it be that the unconscious was created? Could it be that there was a time in history before which there was no unconscious, there was no spirit, there was only one, which you wouldn't know whether to call it conscious or unconscious. I mean, we don't know what consciousness means, except to say it's the other one from unconsciousness.
What do you imagine caused this bifurcation?
I don't know. I know that in historical time we have this horrific story of Babylonian myth, in the sense of myth as the lyric of the opera, which is a ritual. And that all the rest of this story has Sumerian customs, and this part didn't. So I'm not able to say, to speculate that this had a 2,000-year history before Marduk. Marduk was the city god of Babylon, and there was a time when Babylon didn't exist. Other towns existed. Eridu existed in 2000 BC. Ur existed in Sumerian time. And they had their city gods. Every city in that early urban revolution, every city coalesced around a god or goddess. And the form of the goddess was materialized in the form of the city. And this is the whole idea of the sacred city. The god concepts, or goddess concepts, which were successful, which were attractors, created cities, and the other ones didn't. And you had, therefore, a kind of a morphogenesis in the full complex of population movement, urban technology, city design, and religion, ritual, and so on. And the successful ones accreted with other ones, and syncretism was the way in which empires were created. So before 2000 BC, we didn't have Marduk. This didn't exist. Bel-Merodach, he was called, and this was a syncretism from previous elements. So there are books about the serpent, about dragon image in mythology, and many cultures have dragon images, and they're all associated with chaos, and basically they're okay. Suddenly we have St. George killing the dragon. We have St. Michael with his foot on the dragon's throat. We have all this energy given to killing the dragons in Celtic mythology in England, coming over into Christianity and so on. Now, I think it's important that that be undone. I think we want St. George and the dragon getting it on together in the May Day celebration, where Dionysian elements are accepted. I think that it's possible that this particular bifurcation has to do with the patrilineal necessity of knowing who's the father of the children, and therefore the rejection of the ritual in which sexual license was an important part of the play, and that this patrilinear structure involved with the creation of the nuclear family brought about the rejection of the dragon and the killing of the dragon and so on. But this is a speculation. I don't know. Lately I've come to think it'd be nice to have a competing theory. I'm not sure we can blame everything on the patriarchal structure.
But now you're suggesting that it was the concern for male paternity that drove the breakdown of this whole...
It killed the goddess, yes. We couldn't have this goddess around who liked to seduce young men and so on.
Well, the suppression of psychedelics, it comes at that same phase, because the orgies driven by the psychedelic religion completely frustrated that desire to identify male paternity.
The rejection of psychedelics and shamanism and so on could be likewise associated. So now we're getting a certain collage of bifurcation events. And only so-called primitive societies have shamans. They have psychedelic rituals on a weekly basis, and they believe that spirits are alive in rocks and plants, and they believe this because they've seen them, and they believe in the reincarnation of the spirit, and that a human soul could reincarnate in an animal, and so on. So it's possible that a whole complex of things all disappeared at the same time because of some evolutionary selection, some unnatural selection, as it were. And it might be important to try to figure out the mechanism of this fall, because this is a really big fall, and now since these thousands of years we're suffering from the loss of this whole complex of ideas together, and I don't know if there's any one of them which is the cause. I'm not sure they were simultaneous, or if there was one place in the world where they were simultaneous. I can't accept blindly the theory of the Kurgan waves, the three Kurgan waves, and so on.
I think that over time, these mushroom-using people in the Sahara were transformed unwittingly into meat cults by a scarcity of mushrooms and the recognition that honey was a potential preserving medium for the mushroom. So as the mushrooms became rarer and rarer, the effort to preserve them in honey and to concentrate the use of them into large festivals intensified, and finally what you had were mead festivals where mushrooms were no more than a flavoring and ultimately no more than a memory. And that the shift from the psychology of a psilocybin mushroom cult to the psychology of a beer mead intoxicating cult is precisely the difference in emphasis of inner dynamics that would shift you from a partnership arrangement sensitive to social cueing to a patriarchal relationship insensitive to social cueing, which is precisely the effects of your biology.
Then the patriarchy?
The patriarchy and the mead and evolved together along with the concern for male paternity. It had to do with the suppression of orgies. This was a critical decision that had to be faced. Basically, the choice was between fun and full knowledge of the flow of your genes. And once it was decided that male paternity was an important issue, then the concept mine comes into existence. My women, in this case. My women, and then my children, and then my food, my weapons, my land. And this was the whole thing, which this orgiastic, psychedelic, boundary-dissolving mushroom religion was holding at bay. It was literally a pharmacological intervention to keep that kind of a psychology from getting...
Well, maybe it was an accident. You see, an accident in the kitchen that mead took over just because, well, the climate warmed up and there was no other way to preserve it or something. And after the mead entered the kitchen by accident, and then all these other shifts followed. So this would be an alternative to the Kurgan wave theory.
This is an alternative to the Kurgan.
Well, I like that, Terence. I think we need an alternative.
Well, you see, it would happen quite naturally. You have this flourishing mushroom cult on the plains of Africa, and then the drying which created that situation continues, and you get, first of all, seasonality to the mushroom. So that's all right. You just have these wonderful, huge seasonal celebrations, and your psychology can be basically intact. But then as the drying continues and the water holes are further and further apart, the need to preserve the sacrament and to spread it ever more thinly. I mean, this is the only scenario I can imagine by which psychedelic mysteries are lost, is if they actually slowly fade from the zone of occupation of the culture using them, and a substitute slowly takes their place in a way that is at least satisfyingly booze. They went from an ecstatic goddess cult of orgy to a drunken revelry of warriors and boars.
The two-phase theory, the psychedelic partnership phase or the alcoholic dominator phase.
This is one
drug-driven phase transformation, repeating itself endlessly, flip-flop, seesaw in the history of consciousness. I like that. And there's historical evidence as well in Crete, where we see this phase reversal phenomenon went on into historical times, ending there because the Dionysian ceremonies were apparently debased into alcoholic revels, and Orpheus was a reformer, trying to get the Dionysian religion back on track, as it were, with psychedelics away from the booze. And it happened again with Pythagoras and again with Buddha.
Well, and it happened with Dionysius turning into Bacchus.
Into Bacchus. There it was the vine, it was wine.
The early Bacchus was a frightening figure whose practitioners fell into such frenzies of ecstasy that it was charged against them that they devoured their own children. The late, hairy-footed, lascivious Bacchus is simply an image of the alcohol consciousness made concrete. You know?
So if we took this theory seriously for a moment, which we won't too seriously, with this two-phase theory, and then we favored one phase and we're in the other phase, and then we would seek the mechanism of a phase transition as you turn on heat under water and it boils or something. Then we would try to get psychedelic drugs back into the agenda and somehow get rid of alcohol. And this would then explain why alcohol is legal and marijuana is not in these societies and so on. There is some self-preservation function. There's a phase-maintaining mechanism within this phase, which has made it dominant in the past.
It's because it reinforces male dominance. Because Why? Because if you technically analyze what alcohol does pharmacologically, it actually does diminish sensitivity to social cueing. This is a technical way of saying you turn into a boor and an oaf.
Zombie.
No, a libidinally driven oaf is what you turn into. And because you now have a reduced sensitivity to social cueing, and your normal good sense is impaired, you're prepared to make a sexual conquest. And most of the sexual neurosis of the Western civilization can be traced to incidents of early sexual imprinting in the presence of alcohol. How many women lose their virginity in an ambiance of a drunken, groping encounter? And this is how it is normally done in the West. So that alcohol is so spun into our simultaneous terror and attraction for the sexual experience that it's just become scripted in as part of our cultural neurosis. I'm willing to bet that for 1,000 years in the West, nobody got laid who wasn't smashed.
I did.
This was, ends, the period I'm talking about ends before you were born. So it's just a matter of, there is a good, a point for the discussion. The way in which our relationships to the material world, specifically drugs, promote or retard the expression of what we're calling the unconscious. Because one of the things that I think repels us all about drug abuse is that it is unexamined, unconscious.
Okay, I'm seeing where that's starting to go. And I think it needs some really dramatic and very soft shadowing, very deep shadowing. But for the moment, that's very saturated, and I kind of like the initial line work. So I think I'm just going to let it set and dry, and then see where it goes from here. So that's it for the moment. I think I'm going to title it something to do with Pluto in regards to spring, but I'm not quite clear on what the title is yet, so I'm just going to call it as of yet untitled right now, and something will probably come to me while I'm processing the video. But that's it for the moment, Earth. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion House, New Mexico, starting a new oil painting.
Attractive, so then you get pulled away from this one to that one. Could this then be inserted in our educational system, rites of passage and so on, so that people know that they have a choice and they don't have to be addicted
Have a good
only
night.
to alcohol and not to anything else?